Imagine a world with no central heating, no thermal underwear, and no weather app predicting the next blizzard. Picture those biting winds, not just nipping at your nose, but actually invading your home, your castle, your very bones. That was the terrifying reality of winter back in medieval times. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a relentless life or death battle. So forget any romantic ideas about snow-dusted castles. The truth is way more brutal. How on earth did they manage? How did anyone, from the poorest peasant to the richest noble, get through months of that icy onslaught? The answers really show off human cleverness. And honestly, some of them are downright shocking. Think your winter heating bill is steep? Well, chew on this. For a lot of folks in the Middle Ages, the choice wasn't between grabbing an extra sweater or cranking up the thermostat. Nope, it was more like, do I share my tiny, smoky hut with the farm animals for a tiny bit of their body heat, or do I risk freezing in my sleep? The line between making it through and succumbing to the cold was incredibly thin, and the ways they coped reveal a world that feels both totally alien and surprisingly familiar in its desperate scramble for warmth. The frozen fashion, layers, lice, and luxury furs. When medieval winter hit, clothes weren't about looking good, they were your first line of defense, plain and simple. For everyone from the farmer in his field to the lord in his manor, the number one rule was layers and wool. Wool was king. Now, this wasn't the soft merino wool we're used to. Oh no, this was often coarse, seriously heavy, and incredibly itchy. To deal with the scratchiness, they'd wear a base layer of linen. This did double duty. It stopped the wool from rubbing them raw, and just as importantly, it wicked away sweat. Getting damp in freezing temperatures was a death sentence, and they knew it. People would pile on tunics, then over tunics, cloaks and shawls, basically creating their own personal bubble of warmth. But here's where it gets even more interesting. While nobles were wrapping themselves in fancy furs like ermine, sable, and fox, which were as much about showing off their wealth as keeping warm, peasants had to get creative. They relied on things like rabbit, sheepskin, and sometimes even cat or wolf pelts. Often they'd wear these on the inside of their clothes for hidden warmth, trying to get around those strict sumptuary laws that said who could wear what. Can you imagine how desperate they must have been? Hunting or trading for any scrap of fur that might mean the difference between shivering all night or getting a little bit of comfort. And what about bedtime? Forget those cozy duvets we have. Nightcaps were a must, because you lose a surprising amount of body heat through your head. But the real shocker, before crawling into bed, lots of people would use heated stones or bricks, wrapped in cloth, to warm up their bedding. These weren't gentle hot water bottles, they were heavy, sometimes dangerously hot, and they had to be super careful not to get burned, or even worse, set their straw-filled mattresses on fire. The constant fear of fire was just as real as the cold itself. And under all those layers, whether you were rich or poor, keeping clean was a nightmare. Lice and fleas were pretty much constant companions, loving life in all that unwashed wool and fur, a constant itchy reminder of just how tough things were. Staying warm often meant putting up with a whole lot of other miseries. The breathing house, insulation secrets and smoky sanctuaries. If their clothes were a personal shield against the cold, their homes were the main defense, though often leaky and pretty basic. Nobles lived in these huge stone castles, grand sure, but an absolute nightmare to heat. Massive fireplaces would be roaring in the great halls, but most of that precious heat went straight up the chimney, leaving huge spaces drafty and freezing. Those tapestries you see on castle walls, they weren't just for decoration, they were a really important layer of insulation, trapping a bit of air against the cold stone. Windows, if they even had glass, were a total luxury. Many were just covered with oiled paper or cloth, or even wooden shutters, which meant rooms were stuck in a gloomy twilight most of the time. Peasant homes were a whole different story, often showing off some shocking cleverness, born out of sheer need. Many cottages were actually built partly underground, sometimes dug down 2 or 3 feet. This wasn't by accident. The earth itself acted as natural insulation, keeping the inside a good deal warmer, maybe up to 10 degrees Celsius warmer, than a house built completely above ground. Walls were often made of something called wattle and daub, basically a woven lattice of wooden strips plastered with a sticky mix of wet soil, clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. Sounds primitive, right? But it was surprisingly good at keeping the worst of the wind out. Windows were tiny, just little slits, to stop precious heat from escaping. But maybe one of the most surprising insulation tricks was using hay and straw. We think of it as animal feed, but back then they'd pack huge amounts of it around storage pits to protect food, and sometimes even pile it up against the outside walls of their houses. It created an organic, though admittedly somewhat flammable, layer of warmth. Inside, the heart of the peasant home was the open hearth. While it gave them essential warmth for cooking and just staying alive, these fires filled the small stuffy spaces with choking smoke. Most peasant homes didn't have fancy chimneys. Often just a simple hole in the roof was the only way for smoke to get out. You can imagine this led to all sorts of breathing problems. It was a constant trade-off: warmth, but at the cost of air you could actually breathe. And when it got brutally cold, people would seal up cracks in walls and around windows with anything they could find: moss, old rags, or even animal dung mixed with clay. Anything to stop that life-draining chill from sneaking in. The human huddle, social warmth and animal radiators. In a time before everyone had their own thermostat, medieval people knew something fundamental: shared warmth is better warmth. Living closely together wasn't just a social thing, it was a key survival tactic, especially for the peasants. Forget personal space, entire families would often sleep in a single room, sometimes even in the same big bed. All those bodies together would create a small pocket of relative warmth in an otherwise freezing house. But here's a practice that's truly shocking to us today. It wasn't unusual for peasants to bring their livestock, cows, sheep, pigs, even chickens, inside their homes during the absolute coldest parts of winter. These animals, with their big bodies and faster metabolisms, were basically living, breathing radiators. The smell must have been overpowering, and the hygiene, let's just say it wasn't great. But that extra warmth could literally be the difference between life and death, especially for the very young or the very old. Just imagine trying to sleep with the sounds and smells of your farm animals filling your tiny smoky hut. It's a pretty stark picture of how desperate they were. Villages often had communal halls or bigger, sturdier buildings. These weren't just for parties, they were built with survival in mind, sometimes even positioned to block the worst of the prevailing winds. Some even had surprisingly clever double-entrance airlocks, a small outer door leading to an enclosed space, and then an inner door into the main hall. This simple design, centuries before modern energy-efficient building, cut down massively on the cold air rushing in whenever someone came or went. What's more, communities actually organized frost watches. Teams of villagers would take turns patrolling, checking on people who were vulnerable, like the elderly or sick, making sure their fires hadn't gone out, and just generally keeping an eye on how cold it was getting. They even had basic ways to tell the temperature, often clay pots filled with water left outside. How frozen the water was gave them a rough idea of how bad the frost was. This watching out for each other was a lifeline, a social safety net woven from shared hardship and knowing they all depended on one another. When nature threw its worst at them, the strength of the community was just as important as any physical shelter. The winter larder, preserving life when the land slept. Making it through a medieval winter wasn't just about staying warm, it was about having enough food to eat when the land itself offered nothing. Getting ready for those lean months started long before the first frost even thought about appearing. Harvest time wasn't just a period of abundance, it was a frantic race against the clock to preserve enough food to last all the way until spring. Every single scrap that could be saved was. Fruits and vegetables were dried, either in the sun or near the fire. Meats were salted, smoked, or pickled. Grains were stored away with incredible care. These weren't fancy foodie techniques. These were absolutely essential skills for survival. One of the most ingenious and often forgotten ways they preserved food was the root cellar or storage pit. Dug deep into the earth, these underground larders stayed at a pretty stable, cool temperature, acting like natural refrigerators. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips could last for months if they were stored properly. Villagers would keep a close eye on these stores, checking for any signs of rot, frost damage, or sprouting, which also gave them an early warning if the temperature inside the pit was changing too much. The winter diet itself really showed this need for both food and warmth. The staple for many was something called pottage, a thick, hearty stew that would simmer for hours over the open hearth. It was an ever-changing mix of grains like oats or barley, whatever vegetables they had left in storage, and if they were lucky, small bits of meat or fish. It was designed to be filling, give them some nutrients, and crucially, be hot. Meals were often served in wooden bowls which held heat better than pottery ones. Hot drinks were also a big deal. While water could be dangerously iffy, ale was a common drink, and in winter it was often mulled, heated up with honey and spices like ginger or cloves. This gave them calories and a welcome feeling of warmth from the inside out. Can you imagine the comfort of a steaming bowl of pottage and a warm mug of spiced ale after a long day battling the cold? It was more than just a meal. It was a survival ritual, a way to refuel and strengthen the body against that relentless chill. The shocking part isn't always what they ate, but the incredible effort and planning it took just to make sure there was anything to eat during those barren months. The everyday arsenal, clever tools for a cold war beyond just layers, shelter, and food. Medieval people came up with a whole range of surprisingly smart tools and tricks, specifically for fighting the winter cold. These everyday items and habits might seem simple to us, but they were the result of generations of experience in surviving incredibly harsh conditions. One of the most basic, yet super effective methods, was using heated stones or bricks, like we mentioned for beds. But they didn't just use them in bed. People would heat them in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and hold them against their bodies, especially at pulse points, to keep their core body temperature up. Think of them as their own personal primitive radiators. Animal skin pouches filled with hot water did a similar job, the original hot water bottles. Light was also a really big deal during those long dark winter nights. Tallow lamps, fueled by rendered animal fat, were common. And while their main job was to provide light, that little flame also gave off a tiny bit of localized heat, which must have been a psychological comfort in all that oppressive darkness. In areas with heavy snowfall, just being able to move around was essential, for hunting, gathering firewood, or checking on neighbors. Peasants in these snowy regions cleverly made their own snowshoes from wood and animal hide. This let them walk over deep snow without sinking, a simple bit of tech with life-saving results. For hunting, when bigger animals were hard to find or get to, slings were really effective tools for catching smaller creatures like rabbits or birds, giving them a much-needed source of protein. Perhaps the thing that best shows their organized approach to survival was how they managed resources together, especially firewood. Wood was the main fuel for heating and cooking, and having enough of it was absolutely critical. Villagers often organized wood-gathering teams, with everyone taking turns. This made sure everyone chipped in, and that no single person or family was stuck with all the work, especially when the weather was at its worst. Some communities even came up with point systems to encourage people to take part. Those who helped out more might get better spots near the fire in communal halls or a bigger share of other resources. It was a practical system, making sure that the whole community's need for fuel was met because everyone shared the responsibility. These weren't grand, world-changing inventions, but more like an arsenal of small clever adaptations that, when you put them all together, really boosted their chances of getting through the brutal medieval winter. The sheer grit of medieval people facing such awful winters is just incredible, isn't it? From snuggling up with livestock to figuring out makeshift insulation, their fight to survive never stopped. Which of these shocking survival methods surprised you the most? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below, and if you found this chilly trip into the past fascinating, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more surprising stories from history. Medieval winters were a terrifying enemy, a non-stop assault of cold and darkness. Yet, from the drafty stone castles of the rich to the earth-banked huts of the poor, people found ways to make it through. They wrapped themselves in wool and fur, insulated their homes with amazing ingenuity, and sometimes pure desperation, huddled together for warmth, carefully preserved their food, and came up with clever tools to handle the frozen world around them. It wasn't comfortable, it definitely wasn't easy, and it was often pretty shocking by our standards today. But the fact that they did survive is a powerful reminder of how adaptable humans can be, and of that enduring will to live, even when the world quite literally turned to ice.